Hey, y'all, Gary here with Tennessee Stands. Look, a lot of you have been reaching out to us. I mean, whether it's email, social media, we're seeing these questions all over the place. I thought there aren't supposed to be lines in the sky anymore, right? So we did pass a bill this year in Tennessee that essentially through the bill should restrict the practice of geoengineering here in Tennessee. But what you may not know is I believe that bill was filed in about 11 states, started out with 2, and then went from there. Tennessee, however, was the only state so far to pass this legislation. So it's important to preface everything we're going to say here with this is new territory. This is unprecedented, right? To some degree, though there have been some laws in the 60s that we may or may not get into in this discussion. So we're going to try to answer your questions today, sort of where we are and where this thing needs to go in terms of the geoengineering efforts here legislatively. And to do that, I'm going to bring on my good friend, Danielle Goodrich from Tri-Cities area. Danielle and I believe, have been fighting this fight together along with several other grassroots groups for about 4 years now, ever since COVID, ever since people woke up and realized that the government is not necessarily for us. And so she runs a phenomenal group out in East Tennessee called East Tennessee Freedom. Started out as Johnson City Freedom and taking on lots of medical freedom issues, challenging the ballot healthcare monopoly out there in East Tennessee. Knows a lot about things like certificate of need and tons of other complicated issues that are hard to grasp. I also know Danielle is super focused on all of these issues dealing with the 2030 agenda out of the UN, and that spans state sovereignty, digital currencies, things having to do with medical freedom and geoengineering. And so she's definitely a go-to on some of these topics. So anyway, without belaboring the point, Danielle, welcome. So great to have you on.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me on.
So I want you were very instrumental here in Tennessee in terms of getting this bill to where it is now, at least, getting something there. You started talking to the folks that are doing this nationally, running these bills in other states. I know you're connected to that group. And so just give us a brief synopsis on how we got to where we are. And then I want to dig into how do we actually fix the problem and what needs to happen legislatively to get us there?
Sure. So, Gary, we saw this as a very similar issue to what was happening with COVID. In COVID, the government told us that they were going to be working on weaponizing viruses. They lifted a moratorium so that they could be able to work on experimenting with viruses. They told us there was going to be a pandemic. And then a virus was released. And they started blaming us for breathing and infringing on our rights. And what we see happening with this whole climate scam, with this Green New Deal, with this whole rally cry saying that all this severe weather is coming from global warming and we have to cool the Earth's temperature, we see a very similar thing playing out here. So we see them telling us that they're going to be experimenting on our weather. And we see them doing that as they blame us for breathing, and then they look to infringe on our rights. And so we basically, in COVID, we were dirty germ emitters, and now we're dirty carbon emitters. And it's very much the Hegelian dialect where they're creating the problem, and then the solution that they're offering is infringing on our rights. Seeing that our mission, my group's mission, is to uphold God-given rights, and through education and advocacy, we do that through teaching Constitution classes. And we saw this as a 10th Amendment issue. We could point to federal documents, which I can show you one here. Can you see this, or do I have to do something to share my screen?
Here you go.
So we found federal documents where they talked about how they had a mandated research plan and an initial research governance framework related to solar radiation modification. And this is coming out of the White House. This is a June 2023 report. And so in this report, they were telling us that they're going to be doing research on atmospheric-based approaches to solar radiation modification, which is SRM, specifically stratospheric aerosol injections, SAI, and marine cloud brightening. And they're talking about how they're looking to reflect the sunlight and looking to experiment with these different types of solar geoengineering research. And so we had federal documents where we could point to that there was funding that was going to be going towards this, because, you know, people like to say this isn't happening. And so when it came to approaching the legislators, we did some presentations on this. We were able to point to the federal documents, and we were able to get them on board with taking on this legislation. The issue,
they're acknowledging in this document, in terms of their climate change agenda, that they are looking to, and in fact are, but this puts forward a plan to continue the research in spraying things in the atmosphere that thereby reflect the sun's radiation back outward in an effort to cool the earth. And they are telling us they're doing this. And from my understanding in prior conversations, there is already a significant budget attached to this research in the billions, starting with a B.
Yeah, and I can show you some of that. I do have in here one of the things that we pointed to when we were having these conversations with the representatives. So we're very thankful to Representative Monty Fritz. It was through Bud Halsey that we made that connection. So he was very brave to champion this type of legislation. This was something new, and it was something that 5 other states at the time were taking on. But he boldly championed this legislation, and we're very thankful for him on that. But the bad part was my rapport was with Bud, and Bud had seen these presentations, and Monty hadn't gotten to see the behind the scenes presentations as much. So Monty kind of took it and ran with it without having all of the background information. But one of the conversations we had with his office was that they had spoken to Congressman Fleischman, and he had said that there was nothing in the budget for this type of activity. So we looked in Congressman Fleischman's budget, and on page 119, if you bear with me until I scroll down there, I'll show you what we found in the budget. So he had said that there's, nothing in the budget for solar radiation modification.
We're all just conspiracy theorists, nothing.
Yeah. And so we were able to point exactly to his budget. We could show that there's $39 million. And sorry if I'm making everybody dizzy at home as I scroll through this, but there's $39 million that were set aside for this type of experimentation. And they don't call it, and this is another one of those things where they're constantly changing the phrasing so that, we can't point to exactly what it is. But we know from this report, because they say these different forms that I'm going to show you in this document right here. So they point to $39 million. The recommendation provides not less than $39 million to improve the understanding of key cloud, aerosol, precipitation, and radiation processes. And it talks about the department is encouraged to coordinate with the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies as relevant to support analysis of near-term climate risks and impacts on infrastructures and communities. And if we go to the congressionally, if we look through this plan, we can see that they call this climate mitigation in the mandated solar radiation modification program. And then it says, even here down at the bottom, it says the committee supports the department's efforts to develop a 5-year plan for research to support a scientific assessment of near-term climate risk and solar climate interventions. So they're telling you, they're funding, and they're looking to fund these types of climate interventions that are mentioned in this plan. And so we were able to point to that budget, and there's a lot more. We sent, and you could go on and on with this, but I'll just give you a couple up at the top here of the other examples where we're finding solar radiation modification and these SAI processes in there. You got the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, their climate research, weather and air chemistry research. They have 114.8 million. Universities are participating in this. You have the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. You have NASA involved. You have the U.S. Air Force. They requested support for these programs, $196.2 million.
Yeah, interesting to know the Department of Defense is involved in these research programs as well. So.
Yeah, and then you have the FAA. So you have a request for $274.4 million for aviation weather-related operations, research, and development costs. And so, when they were saying that Congressman Fleischman said that this wasn't in the budget, and then we could point to it being not only in the budget, but in his report.
With an explanation attached.
Yeah, and referencing the same language that they're referencing in the solar radiation modification mandate, mandated research. We had what we needed. Additionally, we were able to show that it already existed in code, which I'll pull that up here real quick. But we have Tennessee Code Annotated. And I'd love help on this if you know how to look up when. We believe this code was added in 2020 with Governor Lee's emergency authority with his emergency management. So that's what it's under. It's 58-2-116 emergency management. And you find it in here. It says at the governor's direction, state agencies, including but not limited to those charged with responsibilities in connection with floodplain management, stream encroachment, and flow regulation, weather modification. So weather modification is currently in code, and it's under the governor's emergency management authority. I would love to know who added this code, what legislation that came in. If you have any insight there.
I can definitely help you. I can definitely help you find that. I also wanted to point out too, on this document you have open right now, go down to page 9 on this White House document, because these were a couple of things I was looking at this morning, and I thought these were statements that folks should see. So yeah, keep going. Right here. So scroll down to right there, international cooperation, so they're also telling you with this, again, this congressionally mandated research plan, that we are going to be cooperating with the global scientific community in this SRM research. And then scroll down to page 10. There's another statement made that I thought was fairly interesting. So right here, they acknowledge, let's see, where is it?
They also mention in here greenhouse gases, which I can get into.
Right here. It tells us right there in the middle of that first paragraph. Interest in SRM is heightened as greenhouse gases continue to accumulate in the atmosphere, and as science tells us more about the risks associated with exceeding global temperature targets. At the same time, so here's the kicker. This is part of the research. At the same time, deployment of SRM would inevitably involve its own risks, almost all of which are poorly understood and some of which are unknown. So what they're telling us in this research is that we know we're going to fund a bunch of spraying of stuff, of aerosols in the atmosphere. And the effort is, of course, because we know the planet's about to die. And so we're trying to fix that to reject the sun's radiation. However, we just want you to know, we understand we're not really sure what's going to happen. We don't know if this is going to affect your health. We don't know if this is going to kill off ecosystems. We're not sure. The risks are not very understood. I mean, it's incredible to me that you have a White House plan that's willing to just spend billions of dollars spraying things into the atmosphere, and we're supposed to be okay with that, even though they're telling us there are risks, and quote, all of which are poorly understood and some of which are we should at least be able to, beyond poorly understanding what the risk might be, before we start spraying chemicals over the population. No?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we could get.
So let's jump to where the Tennessee law is right now.
So I'll pull up the law right now. Um, I want to thank the folks over at Zero Geoengineering. They are really the subject matter experts on this and doing a lot of the behind the scenes work, and we're very thankful to them. And it's a great resource for anybody who wants to check out what all these states are doing. They can go to their website and check it out here. But this talks about the legislation that we were able to get passed. So I do want to say, this is not the legislation that we had submitted as model legislation. We had actually submitted New Hampshire 1700 at the time. And New Hampshire 1700 had an enforcement mechanism. It had stronger language. Unfortunately, I think what happened was, Monty, he wanted to be able to help us get this through, and he spoke with TDEC, and he put together something that TDEC was okay with getting through. And I can talk about some of the issues with TDEC as we go through this.
What is TDEC, just for viewers?
It actually says right here. So it's the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And I apologize. I think I've actually said that wrong in some interviews, and want to make sure I get that right. But it's Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And they were who was given authority over their air pollution division. And we have been receiving some emails back from them. But to take a look at this legislation here, it says, whereas it is documented that the federal government or other entities acting on the federal government's behalf or at the federal government's request may conduct geoengineering experiments by intentionally dispersing chemicals into the atmosphere, and those activities may occur within the state of Tennessee. And whereas the risk to human health and environmental welfare from broad-scale geoengineering is currently not well understood, and whereas the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation is responsible for monitoring air, soil, and water quality and regulating industrial and agricultural emissions into the air, soil, and water within the state of Tennessee to ensure the safety of the public while not impeding agriculture or commerce within the state. And whereas it is the intent of the General Assembly to protect the public health and welfare of Tennesseans while allowing all authorized activities permitted under state law now therefore be enacted. And then it goes on to say the intentional injection, release, or dispersion by any means of chemicals, chemical compounds, substances, or apparatus within the borders of the state into the atmosphere with the express purpose of affecting temperature, weather, or the intensity of the sunlight is prohibited. So some of the issue that we currently have where we think we can make the legislation stronger is by adding solar radiation modification into here along with the definition. And we can find this. I don't have to I guess I could toggle over to it. So we do see in some of this legislation that has been entered since our legislation, you have SB 1264, which was introduced in Pennsylvania, which is prohibiting solar radiation modification.
Which is in committee right now in Pennsylvania.
Correct. And a lot of, I got started in medical freedom, and a lot of people will recognize the name Senator Mastriano. He is the one who is carrying this legislation. And I'd tell you to go check out his op-ed. He wrote an amazing op-ed, and it's on Zero Geoengineering. You can find it on there. But the reasons why we need this legislation.
Well, actually, I have that. Let me pull that up really quick, because I saw you sent me that link, and I was reading through something this morning, and I want to make sure people get this. I thought this was a great statement on his op-ed, just again because I wanted to dispel this is a novel idea to so many folks. It was to me. It sounds conspiracy theory. Of course, the government's not changing the weather. It sounds like a sci-fi movie, but here, and I was just exposed to this yesterday in terms of learning that we had laws on the books in the 1960s concerning rainmaking. So here's a statement from his op-ed. The Pennsylvania General Assembly in 1967 passed the Weather Modification Regulating Rainmaking Act, creating a weather modification board within the Department of Agriculture. Again, this was 1967. This legislation was in response to unauthorized cloud seeding by the Blue Ridge Weather Modification Association, which released silver iodide into the air to suppress hail in Fulton and Franklin counties. Similar laws were enacted in Maryland and West Virginia in the 1960s, following complaints from farmers that cloud seeding caused droughts. The public also objected to the U.S. government's use of cloud seeding as a weapon of war in Vietnam. So just to make the point for everyone that this is not something new. This is actually something that's been our government has been engaging with for a long time, and we've been working legislatively to correct.
That's right. So you mentioned the laws in Maryland. So I pulled it up here. This was from 1965, Chapter 192, Senate Bill 348, and it talks about an act to add new section and natural resources, subtitle agriculture, and it talks about cloud seeding to prohibit persons in the state from engaging in weather modification by means of cloud seeding or otherwise to prohibit the use of ground generators for weather modification, both for a limited period of time and to provide for the automatic expiration of this act. So there is precedent on the books, and this is what what a lot of the model legislation actually looked to was this precedent. And there was other states as well that had similar legislation in the books. And we looked at this as precedent because several of them actually used law enforcement as the enforcement mechanism. So they didn't use a TDEC, they used law enforcement, and it worked. And
yeah, that's a really important point to make, is that these laws in the 1960s had an enforcement mechanism which enabled state law enforcement and county sheriffs to enforce these laws on the books. You could, if you were, according to the law back then, if you were a citizen, for example, in Williamson County, and I saw lines in the sky, or I saw some sort of impact that I perceived to be weather modification, right? I could go to my local sheriff, and he could begin to act on that information.
That's right. And that's more what we're looking for. And I will speak to that real quickly. So the reason why we weren't able to get enforcement added with this legislation this time around was because it would have carried a fiscal note. And all of
Which
the
they would have
legislation.
killed.
What was that?
Which they would have killed the bill.
And they would have killed. So they were saying, it would have been placed behind the budget and the bill would get killed. And that's what we were seeing that for bills that even only had $1,000 fiscal notes attached to it. And this even came up in committee. So Senator Frank Nicely, he said to Senator Steve Sutherland, he was like, this needs enforcement. And Senator Steve Sutherland looked to Nicely and he said, well, we can't add it because it's gonna kill it. We just need to get it through. So we did look at this as a first step piece of legislation. We knew we were going to have to come back, and we knew we were going to have to add enforcement. And it's too bad in Tennessee that this problem is really systemic, because it's not just this piece of legislation. There's, and this, Gary, better than most people across the state, that there's lots of laws on the books that are not being enforced. I mean,
for example, we run around the state and on national news saying we've banned CRT here in Tennessee, yet we know it's still in schools. And the reason that it's still in schools is because there's no enforcement mechanism, and there's no one held accountable by the law if CRT is found to be in school. So it's still there. No laws with no teeth don't do anything. And so that's where we often find ourselves. But like you say, enforcement comes with a fiscal note. And what I want people to understand is that then needs to get added into the governor's budget for approval by the General Assembly. And when you start talking about, it's one thing for folks to vote on a bill like this and hit the yes button. It's another thing to get the governor's office, number one, to put enforcement in the budget and pay for it, and then get the General Assembly to pass it.
That's right. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to get enforcement added this time around. But I mean, look at all of this other legislation that still does not have enforcement. So
tell us where we go from here. What are the next steps that we need to see legislatively to make happen?
So one of the first things that we want to do is remove the code for weather modification and repeal that 58-2-116 that gives the governor authority to do weather modification. And that would be a separate piece of legislation, which we would love to see carried. We do not have that sponsored. I know Representative Halsey has said in the past that is something that he would consider. Also, in terms of this legislation, what we want to see done to it, We want to add solar radiation modification, and we want to define it. It currently is not listed in here with a definition, and we want to do that because they keep changing the definitions, like we see the liberals do, how they like to change definitions of, even a woman they can't define now. But we want to see them add SRM per geoengineering into this, and we want it defined as solar radiation modification means an experiment in the Earth's climatic system involving the release of pollutants that reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. So scientific dimensions of SRM include the use of interoperable ground-based, airborne, and space-based facilities, which is another part that we neglected to get added to this. So and I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but I do just want to show your audience real quick that there is more to this than just the aerosols in the sky, that there's patents that show that the ground-based and space-based satellites are involved in here.
Yeah, let's go do it.
So this first patent here, you can see the ground-based and space-based infrastructure that is involved in this. So you have the aerosols, you have the cloud seeding coming from being emitted from the plane, and then you have the ground-based and space-based infrastructure, which is interacting with this. And then the second image that I gave you, it goes into the detail of it more, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on how all of this works. Hopefully we can get maybe an expert to come on and get into all the details on how exactly this works. I'm going to stick to the legislation and what needs to happen with this. So as it reads right now, it's talking about, it actually doesn't make any mention about the ground or space-based infrastructure. So we did want to add a piece in there to say we wanted to add physical agents. So that would include the ground-based and space-based infrastructure. And then where it says in here, it says for the express purpose of affecting temperature, weather, or the intensity of the sunlight, there is, for how it's worded right now, they have the ability to put their hands up and say, well, it wasn't for the express purpose of it. We were just
other purposes, right?
So we want to put in there for purposes including. And then, as I was saying pause, just want to
pause right there, because that's a really important point. So you showed us earlier this document from the White House, June 2023, regarding congressionally mandated research. So what you're saying right now in terms of what needs to be in the law, that's important to point out that all of these actions being taken under this program are considered research. But what you need to understand is it is the research that they're using as the act of doing. Whenever they say research, they're not talking about just like pen and paper and computer programs and trying to they are talking about research by the experimentation process of actually spraying the stuff in the sky and engaging in weather modification. So it's important to point out, you can't, if you want to ban this stuff because of the risk involved, which they admit that they're unsure of, you have to also ban the research, because they are doing the deed, right, under the guise of research. They are experimenting on us under the guise of the phrase research. And like you say, that needs to be added into the law.
That's right. And we also, under that same frame that you're discussing right now, we do want to remove TDEC. We don't want them to be the authority that's supposed to be enforcing this. I mean, right now it's interesting anyways, because you have them saying, oh, we can't do anything. It's the FAA. It's their jurisdiction. We can't do anything. I mean, we have this email here. It was a response.
That wasn't the case in the 60s, apparently, in Pennsylvania.
That's right. It wasn't. And that's what we want to go back to. So Bill McCabe, he's a manager of Division of Air Pollution Control, Nashville, in Columbia Environmental Field Offices. So he's in TDEC, and he has been responding back to people's inquiries on why is this still happening. And he's saying, well, we can't do anything. So it's the FAA's jurisdiction. I mean, his title is Division of Air Pollution Control. How are you going to stop pollution? How are you supposed to stop air pollution if you're saying that you don't have jurisdiction to do that? And there's other conflicts of interest with TDEC. TDEC is also responsible currently for enacting Biden's climate action plan that was funded in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. It's made its way to Tennessee as the Tennessee Volunteer Emissions Reduction Strategy. It's all about climate change. It's all about the same language that we're seeing in the solar radiation modification plan. And so we're expecting that TDEC is going to stop what is the rally cry for this plan that they're supposed to enact. And I don't think we're going to see that happen. And we're not currently seeing that happen. So we want to remove TDEC, and we want to put it to the sheriffs and to the police and law enforcement as it was in the precedent legislation that we saw from the 1960s.
And you expressed to me, which was really encouraging to hear, you spoke with your sheriff out there in Washington County, and he was open to the idea that, you know, if this were to move forward and he was given that authority per a piece of legislation, then he thought it made sense. He was willing to work with citizens to enforce this.
That's right. So our sheriff, when he was campaigning, we actually had all three of our sheriff candidates here come take a Constitution class with Jeff Cobble. So he's well versed on what the federal government was delegated in Article 1, Section 8, and what defers to the 9th and 10th Amendment. And we see this as a 10th Amendment issue. The whole idea here was to claim governance over this and to say, you do not have the consent of Tennesseans to dump pollution on us. And that's what this is. And so our sheriff agrees with us that, you know, this is a 10th Amendment issue. And this is how Monty Fritz has framed it too. He sees this as a mini nullification. And for it to be a mini nullification, for us to tell the federal government, you don't have the authority to be able to do this. This is a 10th Amendment issue that you weren't delegated authority over. Then that means that we have to put in an enforcement mechanism that works. And I do want to show you something else, because when it comes to all this research, we do have TDEC who is involved in some type of research that, you know, this could slide under. So they have the Tennessee Division of Air Pollution Control, who's supposed to be the authority over enforcing this, has a dispersion modeling protocol template. And, you know, it talks about experimenting with different types of, and this is exactly what's mentioned in the solar radiation modification. They call it modeling. And so this is, you know, all the more reason why we need to get it out of the hands of TDEC. You know, TDEC is implementing a radical emissions reduction strategy here.
I would bet you everything I have that a portion of that budget and how they're executing some of these things is with federal dollars, federal grants from federal government. Not without question. That's got to be the case.
Yeah, I was on with Dave Vance in the Tennessee Informer, and we were talking specifically about this Tennessee volunteer emission reduction strategy and all the money that's coming in for it. They're currently vying for, I might get this figure wrong, so let me just check myself. I believe it's $488 million to implement this statewide plan, this priority climate or preliminary climate action plan. And this is in a Republican state that we have Biden's radical climate plan to reduce emissions. And
Biden, because this administration will do anything for federal dollars. They love it. Love the federal dollars.
And Biden says, I mean, he wants net zero emissions by 2050. So what does that look like? I mean, you had TDEC, Greg Young over at TDEC, who says that Tennessee wants to be the epicenter for the electric vehicle transition here in Tennessee. And yet you only have, you know, 0.9% of our vehicles are electric vehicles, 22,000 out of 23 million. And so Tennesseans don't have a taste for this, but if they're going to be enacting this plan, what is that going to look like? Are we not going to have a choice? And that, you know, that's a big issue too. But so we want to take it out of the hands of TDEC, and we want to look to some of this other legislation. So we have, you know, in Pennsylvania and in Ohio, they're giving it to, I just want to read a section of this, and I want to make sure I have the right one pulled up here. And if it's not this one, it's the other legislation. But they talk about how if they violate the law, that hold on one second, just let me pull it up.
They'll be put in the gulag.
Yeah, so they have penalties and enforcement. An entity that engages in an atmospheric activity or uses an unmarked or unidentified aircraft or other vehicle or facility to carry out weather engineering or other polluting atmospheric activity shall have committed a felony and shall pay a fine of not less than $500,000 or be in prison for not less than 2 years.
Woo.
Be guilty of a separate offense for each day during which activity has been conducted, repeated, or continued. Be deemed in violation and subject to any further penalties of the Act of January 8th, 1960, Air Pollution Control Act. And so there's a lot stronger language and
Absolutely.
and some of this other legislation. And it says, implementation here, the Pennsylvania State Police or Sheriff is authorized to and shall implement this act, determining whether violations have occurred.
So that's huge. So the bill right now that's in committee submitted in Pennsylvania does have enforcement by local sheriffs and state police.
And I might get this confused, and I don't want to. I just want to be sure. Yes, that was the Pennsylvania one.
Yep.
Just want to make sure I had the Pennsylvania one pulled up. So that was the language.
It says Pennsylvania State Police right there. Yeah. So
yes, that was the Pennsylvania legislation.
That's incredible.
So, I mean, they're going strong with this, and I pray that they can get it passed.
Which if they did, then the tables would flip, and now that would be a model for what we need to get done here in Tennessee. Even though we're sort of leading the way right now, as the first state to pass this, we need other states now to help us move this thing down the tracks.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the goal here. There's some language that needs to be amended. There's some code that needs to be repealed.
So here's what I'd ask. Yeah. So give everyone that's got questions right now, that's trying to figure out, what to do, where we're at, what can I do? What are your final thoughts to all those folks right now? And by the way, we've, there are some things being accomplished here. I mean, to even get the conversation, I know what it's like up there at the Capitol, and these things are difficult to get across the line. Just to be able to have this conversation, get to a committee hearing, and actually get this on the books, regardless of the fact that acknowledging it's not being enforced right now, that's a big step in the process.
Yeah, the hearings themselves were excellent. Dr. Sibley from here, she gave excellent testimony. She stuck to what we could prove. She stuck to this, pointing to this congressional mandate. She showed the budgets. She, showed the code, and she did a wonderful job. And Monty Fritz did a wonderful job in defending it in hearings as well, because you had the Democrats who were trying to make fun and say this wasn't a legitimate issue. And he's like, well, obviously you didn't read the congressional documents.
They actually, if I recall, in committee compared it to searching for Sasquatch.
They did. And it's a shame that they were allowed to go on with their 5-minute skit trying to say that this wasn't true. And it just showed that they didn't read the handouts that they were given. They didn't read the congressional mandate. We printed it out. We highlighted it for everybody. We handed it out to everybody in the committee. They had those documents. And Justin Jones pretended like he never saw it before. You had Jones, Clemens, and they just, tried to completely downplay it. But
by the way, Jones, who coincidentally had submitted a constitutional amendment for clean water and clean air.
Yeah. And it was quite interesting to see what happened with these hearings, because we saw some of the Democrats where once they realized that this is legitimate, that they could no longer say this was not happening, they started to change their thinking to, okay, well, if this is happening, why is it happening? And they're like, oh, it's good for climate change. So, that's where they
we got to cool the earth down in a hurry.
Yeah, I mean, I like to point to, you got your Superman villains. Lex Luthor wanted to block out the sun. You got Mr. Burns wanted to block out the sun. So you got, all these villains who always want to block out the sun. And it helps us with our farmers, our crops. We need it, and there's repercussions from doing that. And yet, yeah, that's their plan. So
repercussions that we poorly understand.
That's right. And so,
reiterate.
The next steps here, we're just so thankful to everyone who got us to this point. I just want to mention one more thing. So there was some divine intervention in this. We had this fella, Augustus Dorico from El Segundo, California, who came out to testify against our legislation. So you had some of the legislators who still didn't believe that this was a real thing. And then you have this kid who comes out and he testifies against it because he runs a weather modification company in California called Rainmaker.
Yep.
And since then, we've gone to, and I can show you this too. Actually, no, I don't think I copied it over, but we put together a whole list of the different agencies that are involved, the different, if you go to weathermodification.com, you can, and I think I do have that one pulled up. I think I do. Yep. Weather Modification Incorporated. You can even look at the aircraft that they will modify to use, and it even says that they're getting it FAA approved. So we sent that whole list of different agencies that were involved in this, and we sent all their email addresses, all their contact information.
Hang on and look at that. Weather Modification Inc. has been modifying and operating aircraft for cloud seeding and atmospheric research operations since 1961.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we were able to show a lot of proof here. And so I'm very thankful to everyone who got us to this point. But yeah, I understand the frustration that's out there that this hasn't worked so far. And it is because of the lack of an enforcement mechanism. And it is that we need to tighten up some of this language. So if grassroots can help us, really apply pressure. And I've seen that they have been. I mean, Governor Lee, he'll post something and a third of the comments on there are about this. Why are we still seeing this happening? Why are we still seeing this happening? So, we can put pressure on the governor. We can thank Monty Fritz and just encourage him to take it the next step. And he has said that, he wants to see this as a mini nullification. We can encourage Steve Sutherland to continue to be the Senate sponsor and encourage them to amend the language to repeal the code that gives the governor authority and to add this enforcement mechanism, which we have precedent for in other states. So, and in the 1960s. So
yeah, worth saying this issue is a great example of why it's important to pass something like the Restoring State Sovereignty Through Nullification Act. I mean, this is a quintessential example of what it looks like for states to exercise its duty and its power to reject any kind of federal, whether it's an executive order, a congressional act, one of these three-letter agency regulations, whatever it is. States have a duty to protect its citizens, especially when it comes to abrogating our constitutionally secured liberties, which I would just infer naturally is the ability to breathe, which is kind of what we dealt with the whole masking thing during COVID. So Danielle, thanks for coming on. Certainly appreciate all of the work you're doing out there in East Tennessee. Excited to see your group expand and do more things. And so thank you for continuing to be in the fight and helping us understand what's, I think, the thing about this issue is we're learning it's actually it's decades old. For some reason, to so many, this feels like a very new issue, but it's not. But thank you for taking on this fight.
Thank you, Gary.